Rich man publicly humiliates his wife, but what happens at the party with his lover leaves him in shock. Hello, my beautiful YouTube family. I hope you're all doing well. Please take a moment to let me know how you're doing in the comments below. Today, I'm feeling a little heavy-hearted and overwhelmed. Last night, my precious daughter was rushed to the hospital, and after some tests, they diagnosed her with food poisoning. As you can imagine, it's been a tough time for our family, and I'm asking for your prayers and positive thoughts. You all mean so much to me, and knowing that I have your support brings me some comfort during this challenging moment. Please, if you haven't already, consider subscribing to Beyond Color Stories for more heartfelt stories. Your support means the world to me, and it's something I truly cherish. Now, let's dive into today's story. Sophie met Liam when he was just an ambitious young man, with nothing but dreams and determination in his heart. At the time, she was working at a small cafe in their quaint town, earning enough to make ends meet while harboring her own dreams of becoming an artist. Liam walked into the cafe one cold morning, his face lit with the kind of hope and fire that drew Sophie in immediately. He told her about his aspirations of making it big, how he wanted to leave the small town and create a legacy that would make him proud. Their love story began there, surrounded by the comforting aroma of coffee and the simplicity of small-town life. Sophie saw Liam's potential and believed in him fiercely. When he stumbled or doubted himself, she was there to lift him up, reminding him of the brilliance she saw in him. While Liam studied business and tirelessly worked to get his first startup off the ground, Sophie took on extra shifts, sometimes working late into the night to pay their bills and keep food on the table. She wasn't just his wife, she was his anchor, his support system, and his biggest cheerleader. When he doubted his ability to compete with wealthier and more established entrepreneurs, Sophie would sit beside him, holding his hand and say, "Liam, you're going to make it. I know you will because you've got the heart for it. Don't ever forget that." Her unwavering belief became the fuel Liam needed to push forward during his toughest days. Years passed, and Sophie was there every step of the way. She sacrificed her own dreams to support Liam, putting her love for painting on hold so that she could dedicate herself entirely to his success. She believed in the life they were building together, even if it meant letting go of her own aspirations. When Liam's startup finally took off, Sophie cried tears of joy, feeling as though all their hard work had finally paid off. She thought this was the beginning of a new chapter, one where they could finally enjoy the fruits of their labor together. But success changed Liam in ways Sophie never anticipated. As the years rolled by and Liam climbed higher on the ladder of success, he became more consumed by his ambition. The humility and gratitude that Sophie had fallen in love with began to fade, replaced by a growing arrogance that Sophie didn't recognize. Liam surrounded himself with wealthy clients, glamorous parties, and high society acquaintances who valued appearances above all else. Sophie's simple, down-to-earth demeanor, which had once been a source of pride for Liam, now became something he seemed to resent. At first, Sophie brushed off the small signs of his growing indifference. She noticed how he started coming home later and later, claiming he was busy with work. He would dismiss her attempts to connect, brushing off her questions about his day with curt, one-word answers. When she suggested they spend more time together, he would tell her he was too busy and that she wouldn't understand the pressures he faced. The first time Liam openly criticized her was during a dinner with his colleagues. Sophie had spent hours preparing the meal, wanting to make a good impression, but as she nervously joined the conversation, one of Liam's colleagues made a snide remark about her lack of knowledge about high-end wines. Instead of defending her, Liam laughed along, saying, "Sophie's more comfortable with coffee than Chardonnay." The room erupted in laughter, and Sophie felt the sting of humiliation for the first time. Later that night, when she brought it up, Liam dismissed her feelings, saying, "It was just a joke. Don't take everything so seriously." Sophie tried to convince herself that Liam was just stressed. She clung to the memories of their early days, remembering the man who had once kissed her hands after a long shift and thanked her for believing in him. She told herself that he would come back to her, that the weight of his responsibilities was simply clouding his judgment. She continued to love him with all her heart, even as he grew colder and more distant. But Liam's behavior only worsened as his wealth grew. He began to avoid bringing Sophie to important events, telling her she wouldn't fit in with his new crowd. The first time he said it, Sophie felt a sharp pang in her chest, but she didn't argue. She didn't want to add to his stress or feel like a burden. She hoped that by being patient and understanding, he would realize the depth of her love and come back to her. One evening, Liam returned home from a meeting and casually mentioned an upcoming gala. Sophie's face lit up as she asked if she could join him. She imagined dressing up, standing by his side, and showing the world the love they shared. But Liam's response was a dagger to her heart. "You wouldn't enjoy it," he said dismissively. "It's not your scene. Besides, you don't have anything suitable to wear." Sophie stared at him, her heart breaking. The man she had once known would have been proud to have her by his side, no matter the occasion, but this man standing in front of her seemed like a stranger. Still, she stayed silent, afraid that speaking up would push him further away. She spent that night alone, replaying his words over and over in her mind. She thought about all the times she had stayed up late to support him, the dreams she had sacrificed for him, and the unconditional love she had given him. She wondered if it had all been for nothing. Despite her pain, Sophie couldn't bring herself to stop loving him. She told herself that the man she had fallen in love with was still there, buried beneath the layers of arrogance and pride. As Liam's arrogance grew, Sophie's quiet strength remained. She continued to hope, to believe, and to love, even as her heart endured the weight of his indifference. Little did Liam know, his dismissive attitude was slowly unraveling the bond that had once been the foundation of their relationship. And while Sophie clung to the hope that he would change, the cracks in their marriage grew deeper with every passing day. Sophie's quiet love for Liam remained unwavering, but even the strongest hearts have their limits, and while she waited for him to realize the value of her love, life had other plans. Plans that would soon change their lives forever. Liam's success came swiftly, catapulting him into a world he had only dreamed of, a world of luxury, power, and prestige. The once humble and ambitious man began to revel in the attention that came with his newfound status. Expensive cars, designer suits, and extravagant parties became part of his daily life, and Liam found himself surrounded by people who valued wealth above all else. At first, Sophie was proud of Liam's achievements. She believed his success was a testament to their hard work and shared sacrifices. She attended his lavish parties, standing by his side with a warm smile, even though the glitz and glamour of his new world felt alien to her. Sophie had always been a simple woman, content with a quiet life filled with love and genuine connections. She didn't need diamonds or designer clothes to feel fulfilled. Liam's love had always been enough. But as Liam became more immersed in his new lifestyle, Sophie began to notice subtle changes in him. He started to prioritize appearances over substance, carefully curating his image to fit in with the elite circles he now moved in. The man who used to cherish her simplicity now seemed to view it as a flaw. One evening, Liam invited Sophie to a high-profile gala hosted by one of his business partners. Sophie spent hours preparing, wanting to make a good impression. She chose a simple but elegant dress, one she had worn on a special occasion years ago when Liam had called her the most beautiful woman in the room. But when Liam saw her, his smile faltered. "Is that what you're wearing?" he asked, his tone laced with disappointment. Sophie's cheeks flushed, and she mumbled something about how it was her best dress. Liam sighed and said, "Next time, let me know so I can buy you something more appropriate." At the gala, Sophie felt like an outsider. The women around her were adorned in glittering gowns and expensive jewelry, their laughter light and practiced as they mingled effortlessly. Sophie, on the other hand, felt out of place. She tried to engage in conversations, but her genuine and down-to-earth demeanor seemed lost on the others. Liam, meanwhile, was the center of attention. He moved through the crowd with ease, shaking hands and exchanging jokes. Sophie watched him from a distance, her heart sinking as she realized he hadn't introduced her to anyone. Whenever she tried to approach him, he would excuse himself, claiming he was in the middle of an important discussion. Sophie found herself sitting alone at a table, nursing a glass of water as the hours dragged on. When they returned home that night, Sophie tried to talk to Liam about how she had felt. "I don't belong in your world, Liam," she said softly, tears brimming in her eyes. But Liam dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. "You're overthinking it, Sophie. These parties are just part of the job. You don't need to fit in, just let me handle it." His words, though meant to reassure her, only deepened her sense of isolation. As the weeks turned into months, the distance between them grew. Liam's schedule became busier, and Sophie often found herself eating dinner alone. He began attending events without her, claiming they were too boring for her to endure. Sophie tried to be understanding, reminding herself of the sacrifices they had made to get to this point. But deep down, she felt a growing ache, a loneliness that Liam's success could never fill. One particularly painful moment came during a charity event. Sophie had spent hours helping Liam prepare for the evening, only for him to tell her at the last minute that he thought it would be better if she stayed home. "It's not that I don't want you there," he explained, avoiding her eyes. "It's just, these people can be judgmental. I don't want them to think less of me." His words cut her like a knife, but Sophie forced a smile and nodded. "Of course, Liam. I understand," she whispered, though her heart was breaking. As she watched him walk out the door, dressed in a tailored suit and radiating confidence, Sophie felt a pang of longing for the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had once cherished her above all else. Despite the growing chasm between them, Sophie held on to hope. She believed that Liam's obsession with appearances was just a phase, a temporary distraction from the pressures of his work. She clung to the memories of their early days together, when they had been a team, supporting each other through every obstacle. But Liam's behavior only became more dismissive. At one party, Sophie overheard him laughing with a group of colleagues about her small-town ways. "She's sweet," he said, shrugging, "but she doesn't really get this lifestyle." Sophie felt her face burn with humiliation as she quickly walked away, tears streaming down her cheeks. In the quiet moments of the night, Sophie would sit by the window, staring out at the city lights and wondering where she had gone wrong. She replayed their conversations in her mind, trying to pinpoint the moment when Liam had stopped seeing her as his partner and started viewing her as a burden. But no matter how much her heart ached, Sophie refused to give up. She believed in the man Liam had once been, the man who had held her hand and promised to build a life together. She told herself that if she loved him enough, if she remained patient and supportive, he would eventually see the value of her love. Yet, the more Sophie tried to hold on to Liam, the further he drifted away. And while she waited for him to realize what he was losing, Liam continued to immerse himself in a world where appearances mattered more than the people who truly cared for him. Little did he know, the distance he had created between them was about to set the stage for a reckoning that would change their lives forever. It was an evening like any other in the high-powered world that Liam had now fully immersed himself in. The venue was a sleek, glass-walled ballroom with an air of exclusivity that seemed to drip from every corner. The glittering chandeliers above cast soft pools of light over the well-dressed crowd, who all looked as though they belonged to another world, a world Liam was rapidly becoming a part of. He arrived alone, the event being an important business gathering that could potentially lead to new partnerships. He was greeted by the usual crowd of investors and business moguls, all eager to shower him with compliments about his recent success. But amid the usual pleasantries, his attention was drawn to a striking woman standing by the bar, effortlessly commanding the room with her presence. Her name was Bianca, a renowned socialite, celebrated for her beauty and charm, and she had an aura that seemed to captivate anyone in her orbit. From the moment their eyes met, Liam felt a spark, one that was absent in his marriage to Sophie. Bianca was everything Sophie wasn't. She was bold and confident, a woman who exuded sensuality without even trying. Her perfectly styled hair and flawless makeup were like the mask of a woman who had mastered the art of seduction. Her laughter was loud, flirtatious, and full of life, as if she had no fear of the world around her. In contrast, Sophie had always been more reserved, her quiet elegance overshadowed by the extravagant tastes of the people Liam was now surrounded by. "Liam King," Bianca's voice rang out as she approached him, her eyes sparkling with interest. "I've heard so much about you. You're doing incredible things with your business. I must admit, I'm impressed." Her words were smooth, her gaze never leaving his, and for the first time in a long time, Liam felt like he was the center of attention. Sophie, meanwhile, was at home, waiting for Liam to return from the event. She had hoped that after a long week of work, Liam might take a moment to connect with her, to remind her that despite everything, they were still a team. But as the evening stretched on and the clock ticked closer to midnight, Sophie's heart sank. There had been no calls, no messages, no sign of Liam. The empty silence in their home felt like an echo of the growing distance between them. Back at the event, Bianca continued to play her cards expertly. She flattered Liam relentlessly, telling him how powerful and visionary he was. With each compliment, Liam's ego grew, feeding off the attention that Bianca seemed to give him so effortlessly. She laughed at his jokes, listened attentively to his stories, and made him feel like the most important man in the room, something Sophie hadn't done in months. As the night wore on, Liam found himself drawn deeper into Bianca's orbit. She asked him about his childhood, about the dreams he had before all the success. She listened, her gaze intense and focused, unlike the distracted way Sophie had begun to look at him when he spoke about his work. Bianca made Liam feel seen in a way Sophie no longer did. "I admire how far you've come," Bianca said softly as the two of them stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. "You must feel so different now, so powerful. Sophie, well, she doesn't really understand what it's like to be in your world, does she?" Liam stiffened. He hadn't expected the shift in conversation. Bianca's words were subtle, but they cut straight to the core of his insecurities. Sophie's humble roots had once been something Liam found endearing, but now, in the world he inhabited, they felt like a liability. He had worked so hard to escape the small-town life, to surround himself with people who could elevate him, and yet Sophie remained the same. She didn't fit the image of the high-society woman he was beginning to believe he deserved. "Honestly, sometimes I think she doesn't get it," Liam said, his voice tinged with frustration. She's not like these people. She doesn't understand the pressure I'm under or the kind of people I have to deal with. I love her, but sometimes I feel like she's holding me back." Bianca smiled knowingly, her hand gently resting on his arm. "It's tough, isn't it? When you've worked so hard to get where you are, and you're constantly surrounded by people who understand your drive, but then you come home to someone who just doesn't get it. I get it, Liam. I do." The sympathy in Bianca's eyes made Liam's heart beat faster. She wasn't just flirting with him. She was playing into the exact insecurities he'd been hiding from everyone, even himself. For the first time in a long while, Liam felt validated. He wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a man who deserved to be appreciated by someone who understood the pressures of his new life. From that night forward, Bianca became a frequent presence in Liam's life. What started as casual business meetings turned into long lunches, late-night phone calls, and private discussions about big ideas that only Liam and Bianca seemed to understand. Bianca skillfully pushed Sophie further into the background. At first, Sophie was confused by Liam's growing distance. She tried to reach out to him, to talk to him about their relationship, but Liam was always too busy or too tired to engage. His excuses were hollow, and Sophie began to wonder if she was somehow to blame for their increasing disconnect. The woman she had once known, her loving, attentive husband, had been replaced by a cold, distant man who was rarely home and never seemed to have time for her. One night when Liam came home late, Sophie couldn't hold her feelings back any longer. "Liam, what's going on?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You've been gone all day again, and when you come home you're not even present. Is there someone else?" Liam hesitated, guilt flashing across his face, but he quickly masked it with indifference. "No, Sophie, I'm just busy. I got a lot of things to focus on. You wouldn't understand." Sophie's heart shattered as she listened to the coldness in his words. She had always been there for him, but now it felt like she was nothing more than a background figure in his life. What Sophie didn't know was that Liam was already deeply entangled in Bianca's world. What started as a simple attraction had evolved into something more. Bianca was no longer just a business associate. She was a temptation Liam didn't know how to resist. And as his obsession with Bianca grew, the space between him and Sophie grew wider. Bianca knew how to make Liam feel special, how to make him feel like he was the most important person in the room. Sophie had once done that, but now Liam could only see Bianca as the woman who truly understood him, more than his wife ever could. As Liam's affair with Bianca continued, he began to believe that his new life, one filled with glamour and allure, was where he truly belonged. Meanwhile, Sophie, unaware of the betrayal, quietly wondered what she had done wrong, never realizing that Liam's distance had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the seductive world Bianca had drawn him into. The evening was set to be one of high prestige. Liam had been invited to a gala that could potentially lead to new business ventures, and the guest list was made up of the wealthiest and most influential people in the city. Sophie had always supported Liam, attending events with him despite feeling out of place, because she wanted to be there for him, to share in his successes and to remind him of the love they had built together. That night, Sophie felt a quiet excitement bubbling inside her as she prepared. She took extra care, curling her hair and wearing a soft, elegant dress that she felt was suitable for such an event. She didn't have the designer gowns or jewelry that many of the women in Liam's circle wore, but she always felt that her genuine love and presence were more than enough to make him proud. When Liam came home from his office, dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, he barely glanced at her. His eyes were focused elsewhere, and Sophie, though nervous, approached him with a hopeful smile. "Liam, I'm ready," she said softly. Are you sure I look okay? I didn't want to disappoint you." Liam took a long look at her and then sighed, clearly annoyed. His gaze flicked over Sophie's simple dress and modest jewellery, and for a moment she saw the familiar flicker of disdain in his eyes. It was something she had seen more frequently over the past year, but it still stung every time. "You," Liam said with a sneer, "you want to come with me to the gala?" He paused, then let out a laugh that seemed to reverberate through the room. "Do you even have anything decent to wear? You'll embarrass me in front of everyone." Sophie froze. The words hit her like a slap, cold and cutting, and she felt the weight of them press down on her chest. Her face flushed with humiliation, and for a second she thought she might crumble. I didn't mean to upset you," she stammered, trying to hide the tears welling in her eyes. She wanted to defend herself, to tell him that she was more than capable of being a part of his world, but the words felt impossible to say. She had spent so many years being the supportive wife, the one who stood by him through thick and thin, but now all she saw in his eyes was impatience. "You're not understanding, Sophie," Liam continued, his voice cold. "You don't fit in here anymore. You've never been part of this world, and you never will be. I'm going to the gala with Bianca. You can stay here, as usual." Bianca! Of course, Sophie knew exactly who he meant. Bianca had entered their lives not long ago, a socialite who was everything Liam now seemed to crave. Glamorous, confident, and most importantly, a woman who understood his new lifestyle. Bianca had become the embodiment of everything Sophie was not, and every time Sophie tried to reach out to Liam, she felt the space between them growing ever wider. But that night, something shifted inside Sophie. She stood in front of him, her hands trembling, trying to hide her hurt. She thought of all the years she had sacrificed, the late nights she had worked so hard to help him build his empire. And now she was nothing more than an afterthought to him. Instead of confronting him, Sophie turned away, her eyes glossed over with unshed tears. "I won't go, Liam," she whispered, barely able to choke the words out. "But I hope you have a wonderful time." She could hear Liam's footsteps as he walked toward the door, but she didn't turn around to watch him leave. Sophie stood there in the silence of their home, her heart aching. But she refused to cry in front of him. She didn't want him to see the hurt in her eyes. Liam, oblivious to the pain he had caused, left the house with Bianca, his arm draped around her shoulder as they walked out into the night. Sophie was left standing in the empty room, a place that once felt like home, now suffocating with the weight of loneliness. As the door clicked shut behind them, Sophie's knees gave way and she sank to the floor. The tears she had been holding back for so long finally spilled over, but it wasn't just the sting of Liam's words that hurt. It was the realization that she had become invisible to the man she loved. She had worked so hard to help him build a life, and now he was leaving her behind, as though all their shared memories were nothing more than a distant dream. The quiet hum of the empty house was deafening. Sophie wrapped her arms around herself, trying to steady her breathing, but her mind raced back to the days when she and Liam had first met. They had been young, eager, and full of hope. They had shared laughter, dreams, and promises that they would always be there for each other. But now, those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. She could still see the young Liam, the one who had believed in her, who had seen her as his equal. He had always talked about their future together, a life they would build with their own hands. He had never cared about the lavish parties or the expensive things. Now he was in a world where those things mattered more than anything else. His priorities had shifted, and Sophie knew that she no longer fit into his vision of the future. As the hours passed and the gala continued without her, Sophie sat alone in the silence, reflecting on the life they had built together and the painful reality that had now settled in her heart. She thought about the woman Liam was with, the woman who had become his confidant and partner, the one who was everything Sophie could never be. And yet, despite the hurt and humiliation, Sophie knew she still loved him. She loved the man he used to be, the one who had believed in their love, the one who had never needed anything more than her to be happy. But that man felt like a stranger now, and Sophie wasn't sure if she could ever get him back. That night, as Liam danced with Bianca, Sophie sat in the darkness, clinging to the memories of their past. But deep down, she knew she had to face a harsh truth. Her place in Liam's life was no longer guaranteed. He had made it clear the grand gala was the pinnacle event of the season, an evening filled with luxury, elite guests, and a shimmering array of wealth and power. It was an occasion Liam had been looking forward to, one that promised to further cement his status among the city's most influential figures. As the black tie event unfolded in the opulent ballroom, Liam was acutely aware of the spotlight now on him. He had made it, and he knew it. When Liam entered the venue, his arm wrapped around Bianca's waist, the room seemed to pause, as if in awe of their presence. Bianca, with her captivating beauty and magnetic charm, stood out effortlessly among the sea of well-dressed guests. She smiled, flashing perfect teeth, and her laughter filled the air, drawing everyone in. People flocked to them, eager to talk business, to compliment Liam on his meteoric rise, and to fawn over Bianca's fashionable flair. Liam basked in the attention, feeling a rush of pride with every compliment. He had worked so hard to reach this level of success, and now it was all coming to fruition. He was no longer just a man from humble beginnings. He was the Liam King, the man who had built an empire. Bianca was the perfect arm candy to showcase his accomplishments, a woman who fit in seamlessly with the world he was now a part of. As the evening wore on, Liam was engaged in conversations about potential mergers, partnerships, and investments. But while his business partners were engrossed in discussing numbers and projections, he was becoming increasingly aware of Bianca's behavior. Initially, she had been the perfect companion, charming, witty, and engaging. But now her eyes seemed distant, and her smiles were a little too practiced. She seemed to be growing restless, her attention no longer fixed on Liam, but flitting around the room, surveying the other guests with an almost bored expression. At one point, as Liam discussed a new business venture with a wealthy investor, Bianca excused herself and disappeared into the crowd. Liam didn't think much of it at first, assuming she simply wanted to talk to other people. However, as the minutes stretched on, he began to feel a sense of unease. He scanned the room, but couldn't spot Bianca anywhere. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he found her at the bar, deep in conversation with a group of young men. Her laughter was light, carefree, and the flirtation in her voice was unmistakable. Liam's jaw tightened as he watched her, the realization creeping up on him that Bianca wasn't interested in staying by his side for the evening. She had grown bored of him. "Bianca," Liam said, his voice tight as he approached her, "are you all right? We have a lot of people to meet tonight." Bianca turned to him with a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She placed a hand on his arm, her fingers a little too soft, her touch lacking the warmth it had earlier. "I'm fine, darling. Just having some fun." Her voice was syrupy sweet, but Liam couldn't shake the feeling that she was only humoring him. "I'd prefer it if you stayed close to me," Liam said, a hint of frustration in his voice. He was used to having control over situations, to being the center of attention. And now, he felt the balance slip away from him. Bianca raised an eyebrow, her eyes glimmering with a hint of challenge. "You want me to be your accessory for the evening, Liam? Just stand by your side, smile, and nod while you do all the talking? Is that what you really want?" The words stung more than he cared to admit. He had always thought of Bianca as the one who understood him, who could match his energy, his ambition, and now, she was making him feel small, insignificant, like he was just another man in the crowd. For the first time that night, Liam felt the weight of the situation press on him. Bianca wasn't the woman who admired him. She was the woman who was only interested in the man he could be, the man with power, influence, and wealth. "I just want us to enjoy this night," Liam said through gritted teeth, trying to regain some semblance of control. "We're here to network, to meet people who can help us grow." Bianca took a slow sip of her drink, her eyes scanning the room again. "Liam, you don't get it, do you? I don't need to be here for you to succeed. I could go off and have a dozen conversations with these people without you, and frankly, I'd probably have more fun." Her words were like a slap to the face. Liam had expected a woman who would cling to him, to the life he had built. But Bianca was different. She didn't need him. She was only using him for the connections, the status, and the opportunities he could provide. In that moment, Liam realized how hollow his relationship with Bianca really was. The night continued to spiral as Liam tried to keep his composure, but the cracks in his world were becoming increasingly clear. Bianca was no longer pretending to be interested in him, and he could feel the tension building. Every time he looked at her, she was either talking to someone else or off in a corner, seemingly bored with the evening. Meanwhile, Sophie sat at home, staring at the empty walls of their house. She had tried to push the hurt aside, tried to tell herself that Liam's coldness wasn't personal. She knew their marriage was in trouble, but she still hoped, some foolish, naive part of her hoped, that this was just a phase. But tonight, as Liam arrived at the gala with Bianca, Sophie couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He didn't want her. He didn't need her. She wasn't part of his world anymore, and maybe she never really had been. Back at the gala, Liam finally excused himself from the crowd, a tight knot of frustration in his stomach. He sought out Bianca, his ego bruised, but when he found her, he was greeted with indifference. Bianca's eyes weren't on him. They were on the next shiny thing, the next person who could feed her desires. The illusion of glamour, of power, that Liam had worked so hard to create around himself was fading, and he didn't know how to stop it. Bianca's behavior revealed the hollow nature of his own success, and as the night wore on, the emptiness he felt in her company seemed to mirror the emptiness growing inside him. Liam had wanted admiration, yes, but what he really needed, what he had lost, was someone who truly cared, someone who would love him not because of what he had, but because of who he was. And the woman who had once been that person, Sophie, was no longer by his side. Liam had spent the night immersed in conversation after conversation, the type of exchanges that he once found exhilarating. Talking about business ventures, potential acquisitions, and the next big move in his empire. He had allowed the noise of the gala to drown out his nagging thoughts. However, as the night went on, something inside him began to shift. His gaze kept drifting to Bianca, who was enjoying herself more with every passing hour, her eyes scanning the room for the next person to impress, the next opportunity to seize. Liam's thoughts were clouded, but there was a nagging sensation that something was wrong. It wasn't just the way Bianca seemed to grow increasingly distant and uninterested as the night wore on. It wasn't just the flicker of irritation he felt whenever she took her attention away from him. No, there was something deeper, something that gnawed at him from the inside, like an itch he couldn't scratch. He'd convinced himself that Bianca was the one, his equal, the woman who could help him navigate the high society he had worked so hard to be a part of. But the more he observed her, the more he realized that she wasn't interested in him, at least not in the way he had imagined. And then it happened. Liam had stepped away from a group of investors, needing a break from the constant flow of business talk. He found a quiet corner of the ballroom, just off to the side of a lavishly decorated alcove. The space was dimly lit, and from where he stood, he could see Bianca talking animatedly to a man he didn't recognize. She was laughing, her voice carrying across the room with an edge of flirtation. But it wasn't Bianca's laughter that made his blood run cold. It was the words that followed. Liam leaned in slightly, trying to get a better look, instinctively wanting to hear what was being said. At first, it was nothing more than idle chatter, but then he caught Bianca's voice clearly as she spoke to the man beside her. "Liam's a stepping stone," Bianca said with a sneer, her voice dripping with disdain. "Once I've secured a few favors, I'll move on to someone who actually knows how to have fun. He's so predictable." Liam froze. His heart stopped for a split second as the weight of her words hit him like a truck. Every ounce of pride he had, felt just moments before, evaporated, replaced by a sickening sense of betrayal. He wanted to turn around, to leave the conversation immediately, but his feet were rooted to the floor, his chest tightening in disbelief. She didn't love him. Not in the way he had convinced himself. Bianca didn't care about him as a person, nor did she see him as a partner. She saw him as a means to an end, a way to climb higher in the world of elite socialites and businessmen. To her, Liam was nothing more than a stepping stone to whatever her next conquest would be. The realization stung, cutting deeper than anything he had ever felt in his life. Her laughter, once so melodic and alluring, now sounded like the most hollow sound in the room. It grated against his ears, making the entire atmosphere of the gala feel suffocating. The weight of the lie he had been living under settled over him, and he suddenly felt claustrophobic, as though the walls of the ballroom were closing in around him. Liam's thoughts were a blur, a tangle of disbelief, confusion, and anger. How could he have been so blind? He had spent months, if not years, believing that Bianca was the woman he had been looking for, the one who understood his ambition, his need for power and status. And now it all felt like an illusion. He looked at her once more, the woman who had claimed his attention, his affection, his time. She was standing there, smiling, chatting with someone who wasn't him, as though their earlier conversations had meant nothing. And in that moment, it all clicked. He had been a pawn in her game, a trophy to show off at parties. Her words continued to echo in his mind, replaying over and over again like a song he couldn't escape. "Once I've secured a few favors, I'll move on to someone who actually knows how to have fun." The realization was like a slap in the face. Bianca had been using him all along. The warmth he had once felt for her, the admiration he had convinced himself was real, now felt like a cruel joke. He wanted to confront her right then and there, to demand an explanation, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the shock. Maybe it was the realization that he had already known on some level, but had been too afraid to acknowledge it. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the fear of facing the truth, that he had been so wrapped up in his own success and ego that he hadn't seen how hollow his relationships truly were. The laughter around him felt distant, muffled, as Liam stood there frozen in time. The vibrant, glamorous world he had fought so hard to be a part of now felt like a facade, an elaborate mask hiding the emptiness beneath. He had surrounded himself with people who didn't care for him, who saw him only as a tool for their own gain. Bianca, his lover, his supposed confidant, had used him just like the others. As the minutes ticked by, Liam's chest tightened with an overwhelming sense of loss. Not just for Bianca, but for himself. He had spent so much time building a life that revolved around wealth, power, and status, but it had come at the cost of the only thing that truly mattered: genuine connection. He had lost Sophie, the woman who had loved him when he had nothing, the one who believed in him before he ever became Liam King, the billionaire businessman. And now, standing at the edge of this glamorous world, Liam realized that all the success he had achieved meant nothing if it couldn't be shared with someone who truly cared. He had driven Sophie away with his arrogance and pride, and now he was left alone in a sea of people who only saw him as a commodity. The weight of the truth hit him hard, and for the first time in his life, Liam felt small. Not because of his wealth or his accomplishments, but because of his heart. He had been so focused on climbing the ladder, on proving his worth to a world that valued everything but love and authenticity, that he had lost the one person who had ever truly loved him. Bianca's laughter continued to echo in his ears, but now it only deepened the emptiness he felt. She didn't care about him. He wasn't a stepping stone for her. But he had been one for himself, constantly moving forward, chasing success, and leaving the one person who mattered behind. Liam turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last, as the gala continued around him, the world of wealth and prestige spinning on without him. He didn't know where he was headed or what he would do next, but for the first time in years he felt the sting of truth settling into his soul. The days that followed Liam's departure from their home were the hardest Sophie had ever endured. The weight of betrayal and abandonment hung heavy over her, a constant reminder of the man she had once loved and trusted. Liam's cruel words still echoed in her mind, and she could feel the void in her chest where his love used to reside. But as painful as it was, Sophie knew one thing for certain. She could no longer be defined by her relationship with him. For years, Sophie had sacrificed her dreams for Liam's success. She had put her own needs and desires aside to support him, to believe in him when no one else did. She had been the quiet pillar, the steady hand that held everything together. She had given him everything, her time, her love, her energy. But now, as Liam danced through his new life with Bianca, Sophie was left to pick up the shattered pieces of her own existence. The first few days after he left were spent in a haze. Sophie wandered through their empty house, touching the familiar objects that once held memories of better days. The photographs of them laughing together, the wedding pictures on the mantel, and the little trinkets from their travels. They all mocked her now. The house felt too big, too silent without him. But in the quiet, Sophie realized something. She had to find herself again. She packed away the remnants of their life together, his suits, his ties, the luxury gifts he had given her over the years. She folded the letters he had written to her in the early days of their marriage, those passionate declarations of love that now felt like lies. She cleared his things out of sight, not to erase him, but to give herself space to heal. One afternoon, Sophie came across her old art supplies in the attic. The brushes, the paints, the canvases, all of it had been forgotten in the whirlwind of supporting Liam's dreams. Art had once been her first love, her sanctuary, a place where she could pour her heart and soul without fear of judgment. But over the years, as Liam's ambition grew, her own passions had slowly faded into the background. She had stopped painting, thinking it was impractical, something she couldn't afford when there were bills to pay and dreams to support. But as Sophie stood in that attic, looking at the dust-covered supplies, she felt a spark reignite deep within her. Art was never just a hobby. It had been her therapy, her escape. She realized that she had given up the one thing that had made her feel whole, her creativity, and now it was time to reclaim it. Sophie spent the next few weeks rediscovering her artistic spirit. She began painting again, pouring her emotions, her heartbreak, and her anger into each stroke of the brush. At first the paintings were raw, chaotic, a reflection of the turmoil inside her, but as time went on, her work became more refined, more intentional. She painted scenes of beauty, of nature, of peace. It was as if the act of creating allowed her to process the pain and turn it into something meaningful. Her art became a form of self-expression, a way to channel her sorrow into something beautiful. Sophie no longer saw herself as just Liam's wife. She saw herself as an artist, a woman with her own voice, her own story to tell. She began to exhibit her work in local galleries, and to her surprise, people took notice. Her pieces, filled with emotion and depth, resonated with others who had gone through their own struggles. The first time Sophie sold a painting, she couldn't believe it. It was a simple landscape, an image of a sun setting over a quiet beach. But the buyer saw something in it that others hadn't. The sale wasn't just about the money, it was about reclaiming a part of herself that she had lost. It was a reminder that her worth was not tied to Liam or his success. Word of Sophie's art spread, and soon she was invited to showcase her work at a more prestigious gallery. People admired her talent, her strength, and her resilience. She began to receive recognition not just for her art, but for her courage. Sophie had stepped into her own, a woman who had endured heartbreak and emerged stronger than she had ever been before, though her heart still ached at times, especially when memories of Liam surfaced. Sophie had discovered a strength she didn't know she had. She no longer cried for the man who had betrayed her. Instead, she cried for the woman she had become, strong, independent, and capable of creating her own future. Sophie's journey was not without its challenges. There were moments when she felt alone, when the pain of her past threatened to overwhelm her. There were days when she longed for the life she had lost, the life she thought she would have with Liam. But each time she picked up her paintbrush, each time she poured her emotions into her work, Sophie grew stronger. She stopped looking for validation from anyone, especially Liam. Instead, she found strength in herself, in the woman she had always been beneath the surface. She no longer needed Liam's approval or love to feel complete. Sophie had learned that true happiness comes from within, and that it was never too late to reclaim her dreams. As Sophie's art continued to gain recognition, she found peace in knowing that her worth was not defined by her relationship with Liam, or any man for that matter. She had created her own path, one that was filled with hope, growth, and the beauty of self-love. The memories of her time with Liam slowly faded into the background, no longer holding power over her. She had become someone new, someone capable of facing the future with strength and grace. Sophie had turned her pain into art, and in doing so had discovered the most important lesson of all, that her happiness depended on her and no one else. She was no longer defined by her past, but by the woman she was becoming, and that woman was unstoppable. The days following the gala felt like a blur to Liam. He couldn't stop replaying the moment he overheard Bianca's cruel words, the devastating realization that he had been nothing more than a pawn in her game. Every interaction with her now seemed like a carefully orchestrated performance. Her sweet smiles, the way she played up to his insecurities, her compliments about his success. It was all a facade. And in the wake of that truth, Liam felt stripped bare, exposed in a way he had never experienced before. But nothing hit him harder than the moment he returned home, desperate for answers. He had spent days grappling with his guilt, his anger, and his shame, trying to make sense of everything he had lost. He thought about Sophie, his wife, his partner, the woman who had loved him unconditionally even when he had nothing. Sophie had been the one who believed in him when no one else did, the one who had supported him through his struggles. Yet in his pursuit of wealth and status, he had ignored her, neglected her, and treated her as though she was a burden rather than a blessing. As he pushed open the door to their home, he expected to find her there, perhaps in the kitchen or in their shared bedroom, places that once held the warmth of their love. But as he stepped inside, the silence of the house swallowed him whole. The air was heavy with emptiness, and something about the stillness was more suffocating than he could have imagined. He walked through the rooms, his heart pounding in his chest, hoping to find some trace of her, some sign that she was still there. But all he found were the echoes of the life they had built together, the family photos hanging on the walls, the couch they had picked out together, the books they had once read side by side. It wasn't until he entered their bedroom that he saw it. A note, carefully placed on the dresser. His hands trembled as he reached for it, his pulse racing with a mixture of dread and hope. Maybe it was a note of forgiveness, maybe it was an explanation, but as he read the words, written in Sophie's familiar handwriting, his stomach dropped. "I was with you when you had nothing, and now I have nothing because of you. I deserve better. Goodbye." The words felt like a slap in the face, each one piercing through him with brutal honesty. Sophie had been with him through his rise, enduring every sacrifice and hardship. But now, after everything he had done to her, after the countless times he had ignored her, belittled her, and humiliated her, she had reached her breaking point. She had finally left. Liam stood there, frozen, as the weight of her words settled into him like a leaden ball in his chest. He wanted to scream, to shout, to demand an explanation, but no words came. He could feel the gravity of his actions pressing down on him, suffocating him with a crushing sense of regret. Sophie had loved him with everything she had, and he had destroyed that love. His mind raced as panic began to set in. Where had she gone? Did she go to her parents' house, her best friend's place, or had she left the city entirely? The thought of Sophie, alone and heartbroken, sent a wave of nausea through him. He couldn't let her go, not like this, not after everything he had done. Without wasting another second, Liam grabbed his phone and began calling her friends, her family, anyone who might know where she was. But the more calls he made, the more he realized how alone he truly was. No one knew where Sophie had gone. Her family hadn't heard from her, and none of her friends had seen her in days. It was as though she had vanished, leaving no trace behind. Liam's frustration boiled over as he dialed the last number, Sophie's best friend, Olivia. But when the phone rang, he heard the same thing he had heard from everyone else. "I haven't seen Sophie in a while, Liam. She hasn't reached out to me. I think she's gone, maybe even left for good." His heart sank as he dropped the phone onto the table, the weight of his isolation finally sinking in. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Sophie had been his constant, his anchor, and now she was gone. All he had left was the empty house and the hollow feeling of loss that consumed him. For the first time in his life, Liam felt truly alone. His wealth, his success, his material possessions, none of it mattered anymore. They were nothing but distractions, false securities that had masked the truth. He had driven away the one person who had ever truly cared for him. Sophie had been the heart of their life, and now that she was gone, Liam was left with nothing. The guilt gnawed at him, relentless and unforgiving. How could he have been so blind? How could he have treated her like she was unimportant when she had given him everything? The answer was simple. He had let his ego, his pride, and his need for validation overshadow everything else. He had been so consumed with his own desires, so caught up in his quest for success, that he hadn't seen the damage he was causing to the woman who had stood by him. Sophie's departure was a wake-up call, a brutal reminder of the cost of his arrogance. Liam had taken her love for granted, assuming she would always be there, always forgive him. But now, as he stood in the empty house that used to be their home, he realized the truth. He had lost her, and this time there was no way to get her back. Tears welled in Liam's eyes as he collapsed onto the couch, his body trembling with the weight of his regret. He had everything he had ever dreamed of: wealth, power, success. But he had lost the one thing that truly mattered. Sophie had been his everything, and now she was gone. And no amount of money, no number of business deals could bring her back. Liam's desperate search for Sophie had only just begun, but deep down he knew that no matter how hard he tried, he might never find her again. The woman who had loved him when he had nothing had finally realized her worth, and now it was too late for him to make things right. Months had passed since Liam's world had collapsed. He had tried everything to locate Sophie, reaching out to her friends, her family, and even following leads that only ended in dead ends. But she was gone, completely gone. And despite the abundance of wealth and success Liam had accumulated, a cold, empty void in his heart remained, one that no amount of luxury or admiration could fill. But then, one day, as Liam flipped through the pages of a high society magazine, something caught his eye. A photograph of an art exhibition, the kind of event he usually ignored, a world filled with people who appreciated beauty over status. The cover of the magazine had a familiar name: Sophie Matthews. The headline read, "Rising Star, Sophie Matthews and Her Journey Through Art." Liam's heart skipped a beat. Sophie. The name still felt foreign to him, though it had once been so intertwined with his own. He stared at the page for a long moment, the glossy image of Sophie standing beside one of her paintings, striking him with an intensity he hadn't expected. The photo was candid. Sophie smiling, radiating warmth and confidence, surrounded by an admiring crowd. She looked so different, so alive. It was as if the woman he had known was no longer the same person. She had transformed, and Liam had missed it all. The magazine article described how Sophie had turned her pain into something powerful. It told the story of how she had left the wreckage of her marriage behind and found her voice through art. Sophie's paintings were hailed as masterpieces, expressions of sorrow, strength, and renewal. They were not just canvases, they were windows into her soul, each brushstroke a testament to her resilience and transformation. Liam's mind raced. He had never understood Sophie's art, never truly appreciated what she had to offer beyond being his wife. He had been too consumed by his own ambition, too blinded by his ego to see the depth of her spirit. But now, as he read about her journey, about how she had healed through the very thing he had once dismissed, he felt a pang of guilt so sharp it was almost unbearable. He decided with a mix of hope and desperation to attend one of her exhibitions. It was an opportunity to see her again, to witness the woman she had become, even if it was from a distance. The exhibition was set in a prestigious art gallery, one that Liam would have never attended if it weren't for Sophie's name attached to it. Liam stood outside the gallery, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he knew one thing for certain. Sophie had changed, and he had missed it all. He had treated her like an afterthought, a shadow in the background of his success, and now she had blossomed into someone far beyond his reach. As he walked through the doors of the gallery, the atmosphere was electric. The crowd buzzed with excitement, their eyes transfixed on the paintings displayed on the walls. Each piece was unique, raw with emotion. Sophie's talent was undeniable. Liam's eyes darted across the room, searching for her, and then he saw her. She was standing at the front of the room, speaking with a small group of people. She wore a simple yet elegant dress, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, a soft smile playing on her lips. She had the grace of a woman who had found peace with herself, a woman who no longer needed to hide behind anyone else's expectations. Liam's breath caught in his chest as he took in her presence. Sophie had always been beautiful, but now she exuded something more. Confidence, strength, and a kind of peace he had never seen in her before. She wasn't the woman who had silently stood behind him, waiting for his attention. She was the woman who now commanded it. Sophie spoke to the crowd with such poise and conviction. She described her art, her journey from pain to power, and the catharsis she found in every painting. Her words were as powerful as her brushstrokes, each sentence imbued with the same depth of emotion that her work conveyed. "The pain that I once thought would break me," Sophie said, her voice steady but full of emotion, "is now the source of my strength. It's the fire that has forged me into who I am today." Liam stood there, frozen, listening to Sophie's words. It was as if she was speaking directly to him, her voice cutting through the years of guilt and regret that had built up inside him. He had never understood what she had gone through, never truly grasped the weight of the sacrifices she had made, the way she had poured everything into their life together while he took it all for granted. But now, seeing her, strong, independent, radiant, it all made sense. Sophie continued, "Art is not just about beauty, it's about truth. It's about the courage to face your wounds and turn them into something that speaks to others. I never thought I'd be here today, but here I am, and it's because I learned to love myself first." Liam's eyes filled with tears as he watched Sophie speak. The realization hit him with full force. He had underestimated her. He had dismissed her, belittled her, and taken her for granted for so long that he had never seen her true potential. Sophie had been the foundation of everything he had achieved, but he had treated her like an afterthought. Now she was standing before him, a testament to her resilience, and he was nothing but a shadow of the man he once was. As the night wore on, Liam couldn't take his eyes off Sophie. She was surrounded by admirers, people who saw her for the incredible woman she had become. And there, in the midst of it all, Liam realized the harsh truth. Sophie didn't need him anymore. She had built a life for herself, a life that didn't involve him. For the first time, Liam understood just how much he'd lost. Sophie had risen from the ashes of their broken relationship, stronger and more powerful than he could have ever imagined. And as he stood there, watching her glow in the spotlight, he realized that he would never be able to get her back, not in the way he had once hoped. Sophie had found her own light, and she no longer needed him to shine. The months following Liam's visit to Sophie's exhibition were marked by a growing emptiness in his life. The realization of his own failure, his arrogance, his mistreatment of Sophie, his blind pursuit of wealth and status gnawed at him relentlessly. He had thought that success and admiration from others could fill the void he had felt in his heart, but all he was left with was regret. Every night, he replayed their memories, each one more painful than the last. Sophie had been his everything. She had loved him unconditionally, supported him through his struggles, and stood by him during his climb to the top. Yet, in his pursuit of riches and fame, He had cast her aside. He had humiliated her in front of others, ignored her when she needed him most, and allowed himself to be swayed by shallow relationships like the one he had with Bianca. But now, as he sat alone in his office looking at his accomplishments, the truth weighed on him heavily. None of it mattered without Sophie. The title of billionaire felt meaningless when he was alone, and all the awards and praise were hollow in the face of the love he had lost. The life he had built was a farce, nothing more than an illusion. It was Sophie's love that had sustained him all those years, not the accolades or wealth. Liam knew that if he ever wanted to feel whole again, he had to change. He had to fix the damage he had caused, but more importantly, he had to prove to Sophie that he could be the man she deserved. This time, it wouldn't be about his ego. It would be about her. Determined to make amends, Liam started cutting ties with the people who had surrounded him in his life of excess, the ones who'd never cared about him, only his wealth. Bianca was the first to go. It wasn't easy. She'd been a temporary distraction, someone who flattered his ego and made him feel validated. But he had realized she was never truly interested in him. She had only seen him as a stepping stone to greater things. He ended the relationship with Bianca, making sure she understood that he was no longer the man he had been. It wasn't about her. It was about taking accountability for the way he had treated Sophie. He knew that by cutting Bianca out of his life, he was taking the first step in regaining his integrity. Next, Liam focused on actions that would speak louder than words. Sophie had always been passionate about giving back, supporting causes that meant something to her. He began contributing to art programs for underprivileged children, organizations that supported women's rights, and charities that focused on healing emotional trauma through creative expression. These were causes that Sophie cared deeply about, and Liam wanted to show her that he was willing to walk the path she had once walked with him side by side. But no matter how many good deeds he did, no matter how many checks he wrote for charity, he knew that none of it would matter unless Sophie knew he had changed, that he had truly realized the mistakes he had made. The only way to prove that to her was through heartfelt, honest words. For weeks, Liam sat at his desk writing letters to Sophie. At first, his hands trembled as he tried to find the right words, unsure of whether he could even be forgiven. He had been so cruel to her, had taken her love for granted in ways that were unforgivable. But slowly, he began to pour his heart onto the page, apologizing for everything he had done. "I was blind to your love," he wrote. "I thought success and status would give me everything I wanted, but they left me empty. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Sophie, and I was too arrogant to see it. I was wrong, and I've spent every day since regretting how I treated you. Please let me prove to you that I am not the same man who hurt you." He sent the letters, one after another, but Sophie never responded. It wasn't surprising. After all, she'd left him for good reason. She didn't owe him anything. But Liam didn't give up. He couldn't. Sophie had been the love of his life, and he couldn't let her slip away without trying to make things right. He knew that redemption would take time, but he was willing to wait. One afternoon, as he walked through the streets of the city, a strange but overwhelming urge to visit Sophie's art studio took over him. He had no idea if she would even be there, but he had to try. This time, he wasn't going to make any excuses. He was going to apologize for all the pain he had caused face to face. Liam drove to the small but charming art district, where Sophie had once dreamed of opening a studio of her own. As he parked his car and stepped out, his heart was pounding in his chest. The studio was quiet and peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of his own life. When he stepped inside, the smell of paint and canvas filled the air. The walls were covered with Sophie's beautiful paintings, each one telling a story of love, loss, and growth. Liam's eyes scanned the room, and then, in the corner, he saw her. Sophie. She was standing in front of a blank canvas, holding a paintbrush in her hand. She looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. There was a flicker of recognition in her gaze, but no warmth. Sophie had moved on. There was no doubt about that. She was no longer the vulnerable woman who had once stood by his side. But Liam had changed. He knew that the man standing before her was not the man who had betrayed her. He took a step forward, his voice shaky but filled with sincerity. "Sophie," he said, his words barely above a whisper, "I was a fool. I lost the best thing in my life because of my arrogance, my pride. I can't change the past, but I've spent every day since trying to become a better man. Please, give me a chance to prove I've changed." Sophie didn't say anything at first. She studied him for a long moment, her face unreadable. The silence between them was heavy, filled with years of hurt and regret. But then Sophie lowered her paintbrush and took a deep breath. "I don't know if you can make up for everything you've done, Liam," she said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But I'll give you a chance, not for you, but for me, because I deserve to see if you've truly changed." Liam's heart swelled with a mix of relief and gratitude. It wasn't an easy forgiveness, but it was a start. And that in itself meant everything. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he was willing to fight for Sophie, to show her every day that he could be the man she had always believed he could be. As he left the studio that day, Liam knew that redemption was not a destination. It was a journey. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the path ahead. Sophie stood in front of the mirror, taking a deep breath as she adjusted the delicate silver bracelet on her wrist. She hadn't expected it to come to this, to be standing at the crossroads of forgiveness and healing. The journey from the pain Liam had caused to this point had been long, grueling, and uncertain. But here she was, contemplating the next step. After Liam's heartfelt visit to her studio, Sophie had retreated to a quiet place in her mind. She had spent hours reflecting on everything: his betrayal, the years of self-doubt, the love she had poured into their marriage, and, finally, the courage it had taken to walk away from him. Sophie had rediscovered herself over the past months, rediscovered her art and her strength. But Liam's presence in her life had left an indelible mark, a connection that even time and distance couldn't erase. It was not that she didn't feel the sting of his past actions anymore. No, that was still very much alive in her. But there was something different now, a shift in the air that felt like an opportunity for healing for both of them. Sophie had learned that healing wasn't just about letting go of the pain, but about facing it head-on and deciding if it was worth keeping in her life. Liam had not just apologized. He had shown, in his own way, that he was committed to changing. For the first time in years, Sophie felt the truth behind his words. The man who stood before her a few months ago, pleading for her forgiveness, was different from the arrogant, entitled person who had left her in the shadows of his success. He was vulnerable now, honest in a way that made her wonder if, just maybe, their love had never truly been lost. It had just been buried under the weight of pride. Still, Sophie had set clear boundaries. She didn't trust him entirely yet, and she wasn't about to rush back into something that had once made her feel invisible. It wasn't easy to forgive him, but forgiveness, Sophie had realized, was a gift she needed to give herself, more than him. She didn't want to carry the burden of resentment forever. Liam had understood this. He never pressured her. He patiently let her take the time she needed, respecting her space and emotions. Slowly, he made his presence known in the smallest ways, supporting her art, asking about her day, and making small gestures that showed he truly saw her as more than the woman who had once been his wife. He made the effort, not just through words, but through actions. They began to rebuild their connection slowly. It wasn't perfect. There were still awkward silences and moments of doubt, but with each passing day, they began to learn how to communicate better, to truly listen to each other without judgment. Liam had learned humility, while Sophie had learned that her own worth didn't need validation from anyone but herself. Then, one evening, Liam invited Sophie to a private art exhibition, an event she had organized herself, a celebration of the work that had gotten her to where she was today. As Sophie walked through the room filled with her paintings, each one telling a story of struggle, growth, and resilience, she felt something she hadn't expected: pride, not just in her art, but in herself. Liam had asked if he could speak during the event, and Sophie agreed, though she wasn't sure what to expect. When it was his turn to speak, the room grew silent. He stood at the center of the room, surrounded by her art, looking at her with eyes full of sincerity and emotion. Sophie felt a flutter in her chest, unsure of what he would say. Liam cleared his throat, his voice trembling as he began to speak, the words coming from a place deep within him. "Sophie," he said, his gaze never leaving her, I've said these words before, but I don't think I truly understood what they meant until now. I was a fool. I took you for granted. I hurt you in ways that I can never undo, and I failed to see the amazing woman right in front of me. I let my arrogance and pride destroy everything we had, and I lost the best part of my life in the process. But I want you to know that I've spent every day since then trying to become the man you always believed I could be." Sophie could feel the sincerity in his words, the pain of his regret mirrored in his eyes. She knew it wasn't just a speech. This was his truth, the man he had become. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she, but the man standing in front of her now was the person she had always hoped he could be. Liam paused, and in the hushed silence of the room, he added, "I'm not asking for forgiveness today. I'm asking for a chance to show you that I have changed, that I will never take you for granted again, and most importantly, a chance to love you the way you always deserved." Sophie stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure if she was ready to forgive him completely. She wasn't sure if everything could ever go back to the way it was. But in that moment, as she looked at Liam, genuinely broken and genuinely changed, she realized something profound. She had the power to decide her future, and in that future, forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant moving forward, together or apart. And Sophie had chosen that she wanted to move forward with him. Tears welled up in her eyes as she walked toward him. Her breath caught in her throat. The years of pain and betrayal, the sleepless nights and unanswered questions, they didn't vanish, but they had led her here, to this moment of healing, to this moment of truth. She took his hand and with a shaky voice whispered, "I've seen you change, Liam, and I can't erase the past, but I can choose to move forward. I'm willing to give us a chance, but it will take time, it will take patience, and it will take trust." Liam nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. "I will wait for as long as it takes. I will prove to you that I am the man you deserve. I will earn your trust, one step at a time." And for the first time in years, Sophie felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Over the following months, they rebuilt their relationship. It wasn't easy and it wasn't always smooth, but with each passing day, they grew closer. They learned to communicate without resentment, to love without conditions. Sophie's career continued to soar, and Liam became not just a supporter, but a partner in her journey. Together, they created a foundation of respect, love, and mutual understanding. A year later, as they stood in front of her latest art exhibition, Liam, with tears in his eyes, whispered, "Thank you, Sophie. Thank you for believing in me again. I love you." Sophie smiled, her heart full. "I love you too, Liam, and I believe in us." It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was the beginning of something new, something real, built on trust, love, and the lessons learned from the past.